my pleasure to introduce Villu Kadakas, our prolific archaeologist. Particularly, Villu serves Tallinn University, if I'm right?
Yes.
And mostly working on medieval archaeology, focusing in the recent years on urban archaeology, urban medieval archaeology. So, territorial development and fortifications of Tallinn town in the Danish period. Please, Villu.
Thank you. When speaking about the Danish period in this topic in Tallinn, well, if someone was hoping that in conclusion I might perhaps reach some very specific organically Danish traits or interfaces in the territorial development or defense system of Tallinn, I'm afraid you have to be disappointed. Although we have very little information, in fact, about this Danish period, all which seems to be more or less sure is either has some very universal traits which have been common in many parts of Europe, or are very specifically local, either local connected to local landscape or some other local circumstances. But what really defines in here the Danish period is that after the Danish period we know quite a lot about Tallinn, but this kind of transfer from Denmark to the Teutonic Knights, it marks the borderline town from which we know very little. And I would at first start with a kind of description or giving some basic idea what the town territory perimeter and town wall may have looked like by the end of the Danish era, and then I'm gradually starting to go backwards in history, trying to say perhaps something about what was going on before. Some things are yes, rather clear. By the end of the Danish era, several elements of the town structure had been completed. The town behind the curtain wall had more or less achieved its final extent, with only some minor areas remaining which are still under discussion. I will show those later on the map. The town had probably been surrounded by its first defensive curtain wall, it means stone wall, and the main gates had probably been provided with gate towers, although it's not absolutely fixed, but gates, some kind of gates there must have been. And the third, the development of the street network had been more or less completed, with only minor changes in the later period. I will not speak about the street network at all in this paper, however. But it's rather unclear how and when exactly the town reached its eventual borders and how this territorial development looked like, what were the stages of development, or the reasons behind the stages, also when the particular parts of the town wall were built, and if the supposed earlier stages of development were surrounded with a fortification system, either of stone or not, or was it any at all. All these things are provided only with a few facts to lean upon, and mostly remain unclear and under discussion. I will Oh yes, the sources. The written sources are very scarce. There are some, I mentioned only the basic ones which have been referred to speaking about the territorial development. There are not many. There are some instructions by the Queen Regnant Margrethe and her son Erik V from 1260s and 80s, which specify something about the fortifications, first time speak about them. And then the letter from Johannes Kanne, the king's envoy from 310, with some instructions about possibilities to improve the defenses of the lower town, especially regarding the connection with the castle. I will speak about those in detail later. This letter of Johannes Kanne, at least in historiography, has had an enormously important role. Everyone speaking about town defenses or development has been thinking and supposing what Kanne might have meant with some certain expressions or words, and to the extent that many have believed that the town was later, in the later decades, built quite exactly following the instructions of Johannes Kanne, which I'm quite skeptical about, but I come to this back later. But of course the most important source is the preserved remains of the town itself, especially remains of the fortifications, part of which definitely go back to the Danish period. But also various building remains, means civil buildings in various parts of the old town, also archaeological artifacts which help to understand the possible territorial development. And also some oldest maps of a town, although there exists nothing before the 17th century. And mostly those earliest maps, of course, can be used to speak about the late medieval 15th, 16th century town, but with some caution, of course. They can be used to speak about earlier periods as well. Some basics of the historical topography in order to refresh the memory. The limestone plateau of Toompea, which has been the most important natural landmark, and has encouraged the division of the town into two parts, the so-called big castle area up the hill with the cathedral and houses of vassals in there, and the lower town, the medieval town proper on the eastern side of the hill. And I'm only going to speak about this town proper, of course. As regards the territorial development, there are only two small areas in the northwestern and southwestern part of the old town, near the Cistercian nunnery we heard from Tina about a lot, and in the south around St. Nicholas Church. Those areas are still under discussion if these were included by the end of the Danish era or not. Architect Vein Sobel, the main researcher of town defense buildings, has supposed that these were included only in 1370s, but some researchers, including me, are skeptical about such a date. There is not enough data to exclude the possibility that by the end of the Danish period, all of it was already surrounded. But it's only a minor problem. I won't waste time of the paper here. There has been written a lot of articles, and both areas could make a specific paper of its own. By the Danish period, the first curtain wall had probably been built around the whole perimeter. A picture of, the first town wall, about 5 to 7 meters high, with a stone crenellation and wall walk, which was supported by arched niches with pointed arches on the inner side. A very typical solution in various towns in this period. The crenellation with the loopholes has preserved in many sections of a curtain wall buried under the later stages. Some of the sections probably have been built fully of stone from the beginning, as you see on top right here, but some were originally built without the stone crenellation, some kind of timber solution, but probably by the end of the Danish era they were also provided with stone elements already. The main entrances of the town had probably been provided with gate towers, although none of those survived. But Sobel has reconstructed this based on historical drawings, and similar towers preserved in Visby are quite hypothetical, so I won't better show the picture to you. It's just a concept, but it's quite logical that there were towers, at least I'm sure. But the earliest barbicans, this situation of course is 16th century, but we can speak about earlier period as well. The barbicans in front of the gates are thought to be late second half of the 14th century, so in mid 14th century there were probably only gate towers. About the wall towers between the gates, generally it has been thought that Sobel was thinking at least that it was started to build them only in the Teutonic period, second half of the 14th century, although there's almost no data to support it, so I cannot exclude the possibility that perhaps this tower where we are in today, this Neitsi-torn or Megede Tower, might have been built in the Danish period already. This cannot be excluded. Anyway, they were the first towers, and it's quite difficult to tell if they were built immediately after the particular wall section was built, or only half a century later. The types are quite universal. That's the only one with a quadrangular plan, which makes it automatically kind of very archaic and old type. It's obvious that it's been built before any fire weapons, but some others are half round, more common in all the periods, but still thought to be from the 14th century. Sobel supposed that some small quadrangular buildings were built on the two sharp corners of the town, which he almost hasn't called towers, kind of fortified places on the battlement, but we can't speak about large towers for certain, at least. And of course there were some such small turrets with arches and corbels, quite like the ones in Visby and on the topmost pictures. some were built, at least in the Danish period, and for some reason they were all concentrated around this nunnery section of the old town. Some were here, and very similar turrets existed also on the wall of the big castle for some reason. So the Reinzobel is the main and almost only researcher of the town wall elements, and his various books now available also in English. A picture showing how the oldest phase of the town wall has been encompassed integrated into the later stages and still preserved. Now about the territorial development. Well, the very irregular street network has always drawn the attention of researchers, especially compared to all the other medieval towns in Estonia, which have more or less regular street work. But Tallinn, it's absolute chaos. And that's why it has been thought for a long period that it must have emerged naturally from some earlier settlement. It must reflect the situation of the older road network, which has preserved from times before the town, unlike the other towns of Estonia, which were probably planned from the beginning with such a network by colonists in the 13th century. But here it has been thought that it goes back to the Iron Age. But the first researcher who interpreted the network was Baltic German architect Wilhelm Neumann. In 1910, he drew such a map and was the first to use historical town plan as source of study of development. Of course, it must be kept in mind that at that period there was absolutely no archaeological data available. Even no one knew nothing about the building stages of the town defenses. So it was a purely theoretical concept. And his idea was that the first town or settlement was made in the southwestern part of the old town, close to the Toompea castle, very logical in a way, and it was centered around St. Nicholas Church, which also had supposedly a marketplace in this place at that time, and it was all settled by the German merchants in 1230s. And in the second half of 13th century, this town was extended towards east, encompassing the future City Hall area, Viru Street and Suurkarja, Vene streets. And only after 1310, after the Kanne letter, the northern part was taken into use. This earlier stage was really very logical. He saw some parallel streets, the church and the market in the center. Well, nothing to say against that logic. But Paul Johansen also kind of accepted this concept in 1930s, but also added a bit of his own ideas to it. He accepted the idea that the original German merchants' town emerged around St. Nicholas Church, but guess that the market was not near the church, but in a place just east of it, which we know as the old market. This very small square we know from times immemorial as an old market. Why it has been called an old market, no one has a very reasonable idea, but a lot of competing theories, which I'm not going to list now. Some are very fantastical, some are more reasonable, but nothing very convincing, which all could accept at least. So that was one of the first one, and one of the more reasonable explanations to it. And another aspect which he introduced was that another settlement, it seems that I have switched it off. Settlement emerged on the northern side of the town, St. Olaf's Church and the premise nearby, which according to sources belonged to Novgorodian merchants. They had a courtyard and a chapel there, according to written sources, and this Olaf's Church he connected with Scandinavian merchants' hypothetical courtyard, which may have been established there independently of the German settlement, but no evidence of such an Scandinavian merchants' courtyard haven't been found until now, at least. It's just a pure concept. But now we come to the Soviet era, Stalin's period, the beginning of the 50s, when all of those Baltic German ideas were abandoned and heavily criticized as corrupt capitalist, and so some other epithets like this. And an archaeologist from Russia was sent here, Susanna Tarakanova, to excavate the town hall square, and of course the results were very corresponding to this time period. It was discovered that there was a settlement of Estonians long before any colonists came in the 13th century from the Iron Age, town-like settlement with strong influences from Eastern Slavonic tribes. It is of course Russians, a lot of Russian pottery, and of course Leo Tiik, who made his dissertation about in geography in 1950s, could not say otherwise, and he made his concept around those finds in the town hall square in the center of the old town, and claimed to this to be the Iron Age settlement of Estonians, and even searched a border of it among the various historical borders between plots, and has a concept that this settlement must have had a very compact border as well, not just a loose settlement without any defenses. And this old market he explained as a market in this prehistoric period being established there. In later Soviet period, the main research of this problematics has been architect Rein Zoobel, who based his studies on his fieldwork on the town wall. He made detailed study of it in connection with restoration works, and got a lot of new material to base on. But and of course he couldn't ignore this Iron Age Estonian settlement in the middle, and then started to draw kind of circles around it, evolutionary circles, which he even himself compared a bit with tree rings. Well, this concept of such development can be criticized, of course. He accepted Johansen's theory about the settlement of Scandinavian and Russian merchants in the northern part, but in the southern part was speaking about kind of integration of this ancient Estonian settlement and the German merchants around St. Nicholas Church, kind of made a mixture of it. And came to a conclusion that at least by the middle of the 13th century it was something like this in that island. And from him comes the idea that by the end of the Danish area it was all the territory was encompassed already except those small areas in southwest and northwest. Another concept 20 years ago already proposed by Jaak Nell and me, that at least the later phases of development were rather different and simple. We draw a line to the north that kind of excluded this area of Olaf's church, and explained it so that this southern part without St. Olaf's church sticking out like a horn would make a rather compact town plan, rather regular, with a marketplace in the middle, and we proposed that it was probably marked on landscape somewhere around 1260s in connection with those orders of Queen Margaret to fortify the town. And when exactly was this northern area of St. Olaf's Church added, we had no definite idea, but at least by the end of the Danish area it must have happened. Perhaps also in the 13th century already. But all those ideas of earlier phases are poor concepts. No one has found a stone wall in here or even its foundation. It's just an idea that it might have been like this. Nowhere has ever been found any wall which is interpreted as earlier town wall, although, for example, Leo Tiik made big efforts to find from 14th century written sources data about various walls running between the plots and to try to think if this particular wall might be town wall remains or not. And just to illustrate how much one can use his own or her own fantasy on the town plan of Tallinn. The historic plots as they existed 200 years ago. One can draw several very nice circles in here. Like this, adding like this, or something like this, or even Tiik's one version was like this, but without any fieldwork evidence. Some of those lines correspond to natural slopes, which could be used for defensive purposes, of course. So until now, we have no idea if there ever was any marked border inside the old town in an earlier period or not. At least the archaeological find material, the artifacts suggest that all this area south of St. Olaf's Church has had some kind of settlement, some kind of cultural layer from the third quarter of the 13th century, so it's quite logical, but that this area was already taken into use by that time. But if we speak about the second quarter of the 13th century, this material is mostly concentrated around the Town Hall Square and St. Nicholas Church, and something also around the nunnery in the north, but a little elsewhere. And I forgot to say that this concept that there was an Iron Age settlement on this site of later Town Hall Square was heavily criticized about a dozen years ago by Erkki Russov and Jaak Mell, the archaeologists, who took this material, the fine material of the Stalinist period excavations, and analyzed it and came to totally different conclusions. There is almost nothing from Iron Age. Most of it, almost all of the fine material can be connected only in the 13th century. So the colonist town, and but yes, it is rather early in context of Tallinn. The second quarter of 13th century definitely exists there, but no special Russian or Slavonic types of pottery. The types of pottery which were connected with Russians are rather more universal type of pottery known around many areas around the Baltic, so they can't be brought to connection particularly with Russians. So finally we have kind of got rid of this idea of the settlement of Estonians, the town of Estonians in the Iron Age, and in a way in recent studies researchers are looking back to this Neumann concept. Neumann has been taken out of dustbin, of course with some modifications and criticism, but well, it's quite logical that somewhere around St. Nicholas Church, the town wall and perhaps some areas to the north is perhaps such a region marked here is the area where the first settlement of Tallinn started as an urban settlement in the 13th century. In the second quarter of the 13th century, Iron Age finds are special topics which I won't speak today. They are very scarce on the territory of the old town, and recent ideas suggest that Iron Age settlement may have been much more intense outside the late old town in the southern areas. So at least now we can't speak of any Iron Age town in here. But of course we have no idea if such an early settlement had a marked border in landscape. It's just a concept. It's clear that every town at first looks like a loose scout camp of tents put up randomly, but at some point of time people start to arrange plots and street lines and mark their borders, and probably at some point an outer kind of outline was marked on landscape as well. But we have no idea if such first arrangement of plots was made on a big territory, big plots on a big territory, without any intent to defend it with a curtain wall, or was it marked at first on a small territory, small plots on a small territory with a fixed borderline with an intention to build a wall around it. This red circle perhaps could be a line where they at least planned defense line, but even if it was planned, we can't be sure that they managed to build anything on this line. It is possible that the first town defenses were built on the line where we know them even today. So used half an hour, I can talk a lot more.
I'll give you 5 minutes.
Another plan by Raul Vaiksoo, the most recent plan of Tallinn Old Town. You see this red border corresponds to a natural slope, quite convenient to plan the town defense system. And for example, Sulev Mäeväli, who has worked in City Museum for decades, has been searching this earlier town wall exactly on this slope between the plots, and has an argumentation that as there was almshouse of Holy Spirit next to the Church of Holy Spirit, and has said that as those almshouses of the Holy Spirit in many towns were built originally next to a gate near the border of the town, it may indicate that when it was built, the border was exactly there next, and there was a gate of town next to this place. That's quite a good idea, but he hasn't managed to identify any wall in this those blocks, at least, which others would accept that it must be town wall. But he may be halfway or partly right in this, because just this border of the town may go back to such an old time when no stone walls were built at all. So you can't find any archaeological evidence to support it or speak against it, most probably. Or some other lines, yes. With or without the nunnery. At least according to Zobel, the southern and eastern section of the town wall was first built as an earth rampart, and later the town wall was built on top of this rampart. So at least we have not only the stone wall in the 13th century, but at least in some sections it was made of timber and earth. And this he has brought into connection with this ideas of those documents by Queen Margaret from 1260s. Perhaps according to her instructions, such a rampart was built. It's quite logical. So a few words about this letter of Johannes Kanne, which has played a very important part in historiography. One of the main questions has always been if the nunnery was inside or was outside. What Kanne basically said that whatever you do, the ends of the town wall must be attached to certain points of the castle. Well, I'm not a specialist in Latin, very far from that, and but many, even the earliest researchers have kind of come to a conclusion that he was speaking about the future. That in the future those walls must be attached to the castle wall, and I cannot say that he used future form he did, obviously, but it doesn't automatically mean that he described the situation which should come in the future, although since the 19th century it has been interpreted in such a way that before Canne there was no man's land between the castle and the town, and the town's defense system had to be connected with the castle. I'm not sure at all that such an illogical situation existed at all before Canne. I think that there is a possibility to interpret his sentences despite of this future form, so that he was just describing the existing situation, but said that whatever you do with your town wall, keep the ends attached to the castle wall in those particular points, and you should keep the nunnery in. Don't let them out. The meaning of this document may not be much more than this regarding the town's defenses. And when we interpret it like this, well, then we know even less about the town wall and territorial development of Tallinn in the Danish area. Thank you.
Thank you, Villu, for very interesting and at the same time intriguing paper. Questions, please. Opposing ideas, please.
I can ask a very ignorant question. I don't know if there was any research done by maybe Zobel or in the earlier times into like physically drilling into the walls that he thought might have been earlier than might have been from 13th century already made from stone. Are there any physical evidence that they might have been there?
You mean inside the tower?
Yeah.
I don't know if he had ever managed to any drilling or such field work. I think he and Leo Tikk were just looking the documents, perhaps looking in the backyards, some walls, but no field work. I haven't heard of any field work like this.
So it's just hypothesized.
Yes.
And
Correct.
interesting. Anything like that about the towers that you said are typologically might have been from 13th century again, but are
well, it's very hard to difficult to date those towers. That's the first layer of towers, of course. The first, yes, the first wave of towers, but when exactly built, very hard to say.
We have been rebuilt or enlarged
Yes,
during the
yes.
centuries. Yes. Any other questions right now?
It came to my mind that Tallinn's earlier workyards used to be near the town hall square, and it is said that workyards, which are quite noisy and dirty, men are passing cannons, they can't be in the center of the city.
Sorry, this fades away. The battery is probably flat, but you're speaking about this area, yes?
Yes.
Next to the...
Near the Holy Spirit Church.
Yeah. Oh, workyards was here, I think, Tunki and Traiva,
Yeah.
Street in 13th and 14th century, and transferred to here where we are now, in the area. Well, you don't know what people were thinking in the 13th century. They might have, until some point, even tolerated the blacksmiths and potters, but in late medieval times, of course, not.
If I may intervene here and add my own thinking, it's not only the question of town wall, it's not only the question of defension or fortification, because what remains outside of the town wall is the so-called Stadtmark.
Yeah.
And that means actually this is belongs to the city as well. And there have been, as you know better than I, but there have been some stones were marking on the landscape where are the borders of the Stadtmark. So it's also a legal question. And I'm coming back once more again, the territory around the St. Michael's, well, as the great hypothesis, there's no need to believe it, but Paul Johansson suggested that this was originally perhaps the nobleman's possession, well, included now, because as you all know, if you haven't, our Danish colleagues, walked down the Breiterstrasse Light Street, so it's really wide, comparing with Long Street. And that's it. This part is still a bit mystery, as you mentioned.
It is, absolutely. I skipped
is.
this Light Street problematics.
It is.
It has an extremely wide place here, which nobody has been able to give satisfying explanation.
That's it.
And it makes several turns. And
So, all hypotheses are on the air.
I just have a comment on the Stadtmark issue,
Yeah.
because in the Danish area, in the Danish period, as far as I remember, the Stadtmark was in joint possession of the town and basically everyone who lived on the cathedral, on the Dom Hill, including the castle. So the viceroy had his share of it, and the town, but also the liegemen and the bishop. And I don't know how they were divided inside, but you know, in the beginning of the Teutonic Order lordship, the castle donated its part of the Stadtmark to the town.
Oh, yeah.
Before that, it was a joint possession.
Yeah.
And we think that, as far as we know, it seems to have been, let's say, given its limitations, so its borders already quite early. So like in the 1240s, maybe. Which would suggest that why not also limit out at least some area which could be the town.
in this case, it's most logical. They had to mark some border and landscape inside which there should be citizens' households, and outside which should be everyone's cattle and making hay. It must have been marked on landscape quite clearly.
And vice versa, some clergymen had, well, from upper town, from Tombe, and a possession in downtown. So it's not such an, in our imagination, so clear picture which is an upper town, which is a downtown, but this is somehow mixed. And there is a good, very old work on the Stadtmark of Riga. Well, there are similar cases which Mikkel now pointed here. So,
One should not look at isolated from the Stadtmark and the castle area.
Absolutely. Johan?
Just a small one, although there are no small questions in this issue. Of course, the town is legal patchwork, also in later Middle Ages. But now we're talking about Danish period and two parish churches. St. Nicholas, St. Olaf's. And how you could possibly explain that one of them is left out when they are starting fortification?
Well, we don't know, I think, from which period this St. Olaf's church is a parish church of the town. Because if I'm not mistaken, in the first document when it's mentioned in 1260s, there are a lot of institutions mentioned with it, but one which has not been mentioned is the town. Perhaps it had nothing to do with the town in that period.
Do you want to add something?
I have been thinking for 15 minutes about this question already, and it's interesting that in 1267 the Queen donates the right to nominate the parish priest to the Cistercian monk. That suggests that the church must have been founded by the Danish crown. But when exactly? But in the 1520s, it was a burning issue still between the city and the nunnery, who has the right to nominate the parish pastor or the Lutheran pastor to the church. So nothing is said about St. Olave's Church in this forged foundation charter. Well, this is not an argument, but still it could have been mentioned there if possessions and rights of the nunnery were at stake. And you mentioned that, if I understood you right, archaeological finds from around St. Olave's Church come to the third quarter of the 13th century.
I'm sorry, I was probably speaking not very understandably. I was meaning that south of it, the area south of that line here, has finds from the third quarter. But the area around St. Olave's Church, there have been very little excavations, very few, so it cannot be said.
You haven't found anything, recently. I mean, during those recent small excavations.
Maybe a year or two has had it something, I'm not sure, but at least some years ago it was very poorly representative of artifacts.
Well, this is not an answer to the question whether this could have been surrounded by the round wall or not, but perhaps the church was founded quite late, perhaps not much before 1267, no? Which does not exclude that it was still a kind of Scandinavian center. So on one hand, the hypothesis of how Hansen can be supported in this regard, but on the other hand, if the church is relatively of relatively late origin, say from the middle of the 13th century, it still preserves much Scandinavian features up till the late Middle Ages, like veneration of Scandinavian saints, which can't be observed in St. Olave's Church. Well, no answers given. No questions.
Yeah, well, this is a very good moment of discussion here, because how St. Olaf became the central church of second parish, and Heiliggeist Church has been left out, as it served, as we know here, and maybe it's interesting here to add that it served some functions of a chapel of a city hall. I won't go further here with late Sulev Mäeväli's idea, to open a gate there, but still it's we may continue without any lunch break here, this kind of discussion. Sorry. Look at the Live Street, Breitstrasse. Well, it goes towards the sea, but turns right at the end. Yeah.
Just against the wall.
Against the wall. No way out.
Yeah.
At the same time, the long street, Piktana, goes out from the wall. But as you promised, I'm not attacking you. You promised not to speak on the street system of the town, but it's a very interesting to add this kind of discussion to the fortification as well.
Yes, it's part of it. As you mentioned it already, just one sentence. One idea has been that Live Street originally was continuing towards the gate.
Yeah.
But then the Olaf's Church was extended. It originally was obviously smaller. So this might have changed things a lot, this Olaf's Church.
My friends, time is out. Let's end this kind of very interesting and promising discussion, and thank you, Villu, once more.